Well, thank you, Jean-Paul, for that flattering discussion, and it also saves me a lot of time for discussing my own work, and I'll talk only about one part. Let me say it is a real honor to have this degree offered to me. It's particularly meaningful because it represents being part of a global community of scholars, and as you mentioned, scholars who see the pursuit of knowledge and the betterment of society. Particularly, I think of importance at this moment of time because our community of scholars is under attack, particularly in the United States. And I think at these moments when there is such an attack, it is important for us to stand together against it. One of the things that, every day we experience another shock. And the one a couple of days ago was that the United States was going to try to make sure that scientific information would not be used in environmental assessments, Environmental Protection Agency, and to make it more difficult to use science. And I'll come back to that theme a little later. It's also a real pleasure to accept this award with Professor Zelizer. And, we have friends in common. I spent a lot of time at Princeton. And as I'll try to comment very briefly, a lot of my concerns have been trying to broaden out the boundaries of economics. And I also wanted to thank the director. I was very moved with his discussion of Albert Hirschman, who was a very good friend of mine, and who I spent some time at the Princeton Institute for Advanced Studies working with him, and who did more than almost anybody of his generation to broaden to break down the boundaries within the disciplines. And I also want to take this opportunity to thank Poli-Sci for the hospitality that you've shown to me and Anya for the last several months. It's been a real pleasure to be here with all of you, and the time seems to have gone by very, very quickly. As Professor Zelizer, these occasions are ones where one is induced to reflect on one's own research program and where economics as a discipline is today. And I'm only going to talk about one aspect, which is the economics related to asymmetries of information. But I want to go back to when I was a graduate student. We were taught, the models that we were taught said that the economy was perfectly efficient and there was no such thing as unemployment. And I had grown up in, as was mentioned, in Gary, Indiana, and I had seen a lot of things that weren't very pretty. Lots of unemployment, lots of inequality, lots of racial discrimination. Gary Becker, who Professor Zelizer was mentioning, was on a program with her, wrote a book saying that discrimination didn't exist because it would be irrational, and markets would make sure that it wouldn't happen. And you have to understand that. You have to understand, Gary Becker was teaching at the University of Chicago, which is in the middle of a ghetto around which, if you walked one block, you would see massive racial discrimination. But he managed, and this goes to close his eyes to what was going on and write a book saying that basically discrimination didn't exist. ideas matter, and I can't help but mention this. An echo of this particular idea actually occurred several decades later when the president of Harvard said there was no gender discrimination at Harvard, just that women, he didn't say had a different mean, they had a different variance, and that what matters for the university is being at the top of the distribution because their variance was smaller. There were fewer of them in that tail of the distribution. Well, an interesting thing, he didn't keep his job. But those ideas, and he cited Gary Becker's work as evidence that there could not be discrimination in American academia. Well, as I was a graduate student who had left studying physics, which was my love, because I was concerned about the problems of inequality, discrimination, poverty, unemployment, to be taught that everything was great and that was a little weird. And so I had a lot of discussions with some of my classmates, like George Akerlof, who shared the Nobel Prize with me, about what was wrong with what we were being taught. We knew it was wrong, and that's an important lesson for the students here. You will be taught things that you should feel are probably wrong. So our discussion was, we knew it was wrong. The only question is, what was the most wrong part of it? And we had a lot of discussions to debate where we thought the basic model was wrong. And you could analyze it at many different levels. There was the model of the individual who was selfish, rational, whose preferences were exogenous, who had perfect information. And everybody that we knew wasn't like that. But I think many of you know that there have been a number of studies. The longer people study economics, the more selfish they become. They don't become more rational, and they don't become, they don't have perfect information, but they do become more selfish in the way the economists say they are. And that's been actually an interesting area of research in economics. But there's the model of the individual seemed wrong, the model of the firm, the model of competitive markets where individuals and how firms interact. The overall social, political, economic system, macroeconomics, all of it seemed wrong. The question was to lay out a research strategy that would change the economics discipline. Now, I'm giving it from an ex-post point of view. It wasn't quite so rational as I was going through it, but it's a good story anyway. The thing I thought was probably the worst part of it was the fact that people's preferences were exogenous, that they were born with preferences and they were not affected by society, not affected by the people with whom they interacted. But I knew that if I tried to attack that particular assumption back then, I would be excommunicated. Even though I never worried really about a job or, as Jean-Paul mentioned, I left college without a degree because I had the view that this was in the very idealistic days of the 60s, that I should be judged by the quality of my work, not by degrees. So having a degree shouldn't matter if you were going to do serious research. So but still, even at that point, I realized that one had to persuade other people, and that was not going to be that was going to be a hard road to go. But the idea that information was imperfect seemed obvious, and all economists agreed, and that information was asymmetric. That is to say, some people knew things that other people didn't. How could you disagree with that? So that seemed to be something that one could persuade people of. The problem there was to analyze it. People had talked about, economists had their models had assumed perfect information, but not even economists were so stupid to believe that people really had perfect information. So it was really, how do you develop the mathematical techniques, tools, the ways to analyze that in a rigorous way. And that was really, you might say, the breakthrough that we managed. Well, having come to think about things in that way, the question was to re-examine all the doctrines of economics, all the teachings that had come back, going back to, you might say, the beginnings of modern economics. And as one did that, one came to understand that almost every one of the basic doctrines of economics had to be seriously qualified, had to be rethought. And I'll only mention three this evening. The first, probably the most important doctrine, goes back to, as Jean-Paul mentioned, goes back to Adam Smith. The idea that individuals in the pursuit of their self-interest, firms in the pursuit of their self-interest, would lead as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of society. When Adam Smith wrote it, he didn't have a clear idea of what well-being meant, and he didn't really have a well-developed theory. And that it took 175 years until Ken Arrow and Gerard Debreu proved the result, or more accurately, proved the limited conditions under which it was true. But when I came to, with my colleague Bruce Greenwald, to re-examine the question when there is asymmetric information, imperfect information, or incomplete risk markets, our result could be summarized by saying the reason the invisible hand often seems invisible is because it's not there. That is, in general, we proved that the market was not efficient, that Adam Smith just had gotten it wrong. And that, in terms of public policy, is a really important issue, is the presumption that markets are efficient and you just have to tinker with them to get rid of little bits of imperfections, or is the presumption that the markets are inefficient and your issue is where are the inefficiencies the greatest so we can focus our attention on the biggest problems. And that is two very different perspectives. And our results, which have been, when we first got these results, of course, a lot of people on the right didn't like the theorem, but the nature of theorems is they're theorems. That is to say, you make assumptions and there are logical conclusions, and the question was there anything wrong with the assumptions? And one of the things about the scientific community is you put ideas out there and for people to criticize. And you can't fully think through every possibility. And so you don't know, did you leave out something? Is there some change, when that will change assumptions, small change in assumptions, that will undermine the result. And I guess I would say the good news is after a very long time, the result has shown to itself to be robust. The second thing I talk about is the interaction of firms and households in markets. The basic part of a standard course in economics begins with assumption of competitive markets. And then maybe at the end of the course, if you have time, you talk about imperfections of competition, monopoly, exploitation, all those kinds of things. Well, one of the things that we showed was that whenever there is imperfect and asymmetric information, which is always, markets are never perfectly competitive. And so the underlying assumption of competition was really undermined from below. Now, there are lots of other reasons why markets are not competitive. And so now, when I teach my basic course, we begin by focusing on imperfections of competition and exploitation and market power of a variety of kinds. This is really important today because anybody trying to understand the dysfunctions of the American economy needs to begin by understanding that there's been an enormous increase in monopoly power over the last 2 decades. For a variety of reasons I can't go into, but the increase in monopoly power is one of the reasons why we've had increases of inequality, one of the reasons why we're having slower growth, lower levels of investment. So it is at the core of understanding some of the problems the United States faces. The third area I'll mention just very briefly has to do with how the whole system works together, macroeconomics. The macroeconomic, the last big dysfunction of the economy, where you could not say the economy was working wonderfully, was the Great Depression. But it is remarkable that a vast majority of American economists in the middle of the Great Depression said, you should do nothing. Don't interfere with the market because it will be self-correcting. It might take a couple hundred years, but don't worry. And Keynes' response was, they say, in the long run, and the answer was, in the long run, we're all dead. So that was an example where economists, because their lens had been so trained into the idea that markets worked well, simply couldn't accept that something was so wrong that 25% of the people who wanted jobs were unemployed in the United States and in many other advanced countries. Well, in the 1970s and early 1980s, there was a sense that Keynes' macroeconomics had developed separately from microeconomics. There was 2 sub-disciplines, and they had to be united. And there were 2 ways of uniting them. One was to make macroeconomics like microeconomics, and the other one was to make microeconomics like macroeconomics. And the predominant part of the profession began by taking the microeconomic model of perfect competition, perfect information, all those, and then trying to make a macro model based on that perfect competition model. What was striking was that was just the time when game theory was exploring imperfections of competition. My work was exploring what was wrong with the perfect information assumptions. Behavioral economics, Tversky was just beginning his work with Kahneman on behavioral economics. So there was, just at the point where there was a real attack against conventional microeconomics, it became the pillar of modern macroeconomics. The other way, which I've been focusing on a lot, is trying to say macroeconomics suggests that the economy doesn't always work well. What insights about markets can we get from the dysfunction we see in macroeconomics? And that led to a theoretical work on unemployment, efficiency, wages, capital market imperfections, fluctuations, crises. It was natural to go from there, since the nature of information is very similar to the nature of knowledge. That the economics of information and the economics of knowledge are very similar. They have a certain public good properties, certain mathematical properties in common. So it was natural for me to start thinking about the issues of knowledge. And that brought me to re-examine another question that Smith had talked about, which is, what is the source of the wealth of nations? That was the title of his book of 1776. And the empirical observation here is that for hundreds of years, standards of living had not changed. If you look at data on, say, real wages of London craftsmen, because we have data for wages and prices, but lots of different data series give the same picture for basically as far back as we can get data until about 1800. Real standards of living had not changed, and they've really been fairly terrible. I mean, humans didn't live much better than animals. But then standards of living soared, and that raises the natural question of why. And the answer is really two ideas. One, the advances in science, our ability to learn through science about nature and human. And the second is the advances in social institutions, that in a primitive agriculture economy, you didn't need extensive cooperation. There wasn't much collective action. But when you go to a more modern economy, manufacturing, you need cooperation, you need to work coordination. And we developed rule of law, democracies, political and economic institutions, which enable that kind of cooperation. Well, these are the core ideas of the Enlightenment, and they were really what transformed us. The reason why maybe I'm coming to that topic is going back to it is the Enlightenment institutions that are under attack today in many parts of the world, including the United States. At the core of these of science, of these institutions that I talked about, of social institutions, is the importance of truth and knowledge institutions. There's been an attack on the media, the judiciary, our educational institutions, our research institutions, science. And in many ways, the most disturbing aspect, and I think the greatest risk of long-lasting impacts on our civilization, our standards of living, is this attack on our epistemology and our institutions of truth. Well, what I've tried to describe is the source of the wealth of nations. It's based on the capability of our people, of our education, institutions like Science Pole at the core of this. And it's important not to confuse the wealth of nations with what gives rise to the wealth of individuals, to come back to the theme of inequality. People can get rich by taking advantage of other people, by exploiting other people, through market power, by exploiting their vulnerabilities, by a whole variety. Economists talk about rank seeking, taking advantage of political institutions. And the problem, as I look at the United States, for instance, is that our economy has been marked by too much rank seeking, too much faith in unfettered markets, which is at the core of neoliberal doctrines, and too little collective action. Collective action, which is not just government, but non-government, collective bargaining, class action suits. Government has a central role to play in regulation, government expenditures, investment in education, infrastructure, research, as well as social protection. So let me conclude. I've just tried to hint in this talk a framework for thinking about both the true source of the wealth of nations and the sources of the current dysfunction in our economy and society, including the extremes of inequality and the slowdown of growth. I have tried also to hint at a way forward, a new social contract based on a deeper understanding of a better balance of the market, the state, and civil society, recognizing the importance of a rich ecology of institutional arrangements, including cooperatives and not-for-profits. Again, to make a connection with the interdisciplinary focus, the fact is our economic institutions, whether we have selfish profit-maximizing banks or whether we have cooperatives, affects who we are and affects the nature of the functioning of our society, how our society, and there's an interaction between the individual and the society, which a lot of modern behavioral economics has brought out to the fore. In all of this, our truth and knowledge institutions will play a pivotal role, as will the global community of scholars seeking to extend our understanding of the world around us and improve the institutions by which we cooperate and collectively work for the betterment of all. It has been such a pleasure spending the fall term here at SciPol and in Paris, renewing friendships and collegial relationships going back in some cases more than a half a century, continuing ongoing work that I've done with many of you on a whole group, a set of commissions, discussions on so many topics, seminar I gave in beginning of September on recent developments in asymmetric information with endogenous communication and more policy-oriented discussions and reforms in Europe, what to do about inequality and the measurement of well-being. It has been particularly heartening to engage with a new generation of young researchers carrying on the tradition of engaged scholarship and deep analytics for which France has long been recognized. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here and for the honor that you have bestowed on me.